Joining us now to help understand the legal and human implications is immigration attorney Kate Lincoln-Goldfinch. She's the owner and CEO of Lincoln-Goldfinch Law in Austin, Texas, over at lincolngoldfinch.com, as she joins us now on the show. Kate, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So can you walk us through what exactly that Supreme Court ruling does and what it means for migrants now facing those third country deportations?
Yeah, so this is a sort of temporary ruling lifting an injunction or putting into place some protections for migrants who are being deported. The lower court ruling said that anyone who's going to be removed to a third country, meaning not their country of origin, should be afforded a time period, about 10 days, to fight the deportation to that country, maybe by seeking asylum or bringing a federal lawsuit. And what has surprised most people, the Supreme Court lifted those protections, which essentially means that immigrants who are detained and who are being deported now can be deported to a country that is not their own without any due process rights to stop or to block it.
And that seems significant to me because it's not just, the case is not so much about whether the immigrants are being deported. It's the idea that they're not even getting due process to challenge the idea that they're being sent to a third country, which oftentimes can be very violent countries like South Sudan, or talking about the infamous prison in El Salvador. So really that issue comes down to the lack of due process, which should be concerning not just to immigrants, but really to anyone, that we're now cracking this door open to the idea of people being removed from the country and being sent to these, third countries really without any due process whatsoever. It seems to me like that could potentially be a very slippery slope.
Yes, definitely agree. I mean, and we're not deporting people to freedom in other countries. As you mentioned, we're deporting them primarily to these third-party deportations to prisons, or even like in South Sudan, some people can be sold into slavery. I mean, these are really horrific conditions. And the fact that the Supreme Court was willing to lift these protections even when the Trump administration has been violating lower court orders and deporting people to third-party countries against the order, thereby demonstrating bad faith, that's why I say it's so shocking that the Supreme Court issued this decision. I think most people who have been paying attention to the Supreme Court did not expect this to happen, because they've been generally ruling, for due process against these deportations, like under the Alien Enemies Act and things like that. So it's been a bit of a surprise, and frankly, it's been sending real waves of terror through the immigrant community. I mean, the reality is most people aren't going to get deported to a third country. Most people would get deported to their own country. But that doesn't mean that everybody who is potentially facing deportation doesn't now worry about that. So I talked to a U.S. citizen, husband of a Mexican woman who was detained last night, and he's terrified that his wife is going to end up in some other country. So I think a lot of people are really scared because, I mean, to your point, there's no protection. It's sort of whatever the government wants to do.
Now, one of the ways the federal government has argued that these deportations to third countries are okay is that these are largely violent criminals that are being deported to these third countries. So I guess there's two aspects we can talk about with that. First up, does that even make a difference whether they're violent criminals or not as to whether they should get due process? And, are many of these immigrants who actually are being deported to places like South Sudan or El Salvador, are they violent criminals? Or, as I've seen, many of them don't really seem to have any, violent criminal records whatsoever.
Well, I mean, that's a really great point. Even someone who does have a significant criminal history should still be afforded due process. But what I've seen in these third country removals and the situations that the Trump administration is trying to get around are the cases where they can't easily deport people to their home countries. So one of the reasons that can happen is because the person has a criminal history and their own country won't accept them back. The main reason that occurs is that the other government won't or can't receive its people. So won't could be an example like Venezuela, when they refused to receive deportees because of political reasons and political battles with the Trump administration. That can't receive deportees is where we have a situation where someone might be stateless, or they come from a country that doesn't have a functioning government, like maybe somebody from Somalia, for example. And that can, ebb and flow around the globe depending on what's happening in other countries. So the vast majority of these folks who can't be deported deported easily, it's not actually because of a criminal history. It's because of something political going on in their country.
So I'm curious, what obligations does the U.S. have under international law when it comes to protecting people from harm in those places? Do we have any obligation whatsoever, or is this something that can kind of vary from administration to administration as to whether, well, they want to fulfill those obligations of making sure people being sent to these third countries are not going to harmful places?
I mean, again, you're raising a lot of good points. This does definitely violate a lot of international treaties that we've signed, and I think that we will start to see international human rights organizations come out and speak against this and maybe even bring charges in international courts. And this is a violation absolutely of people's rights and the international ideas around how we deal with people who are refugees or deportees. And so I think if we start to see more of these third country deportations, we're going to see more and more international lashback. Is that a word? You know what I mean.
Yeah, exactly. I got you. Yeah, absolutely. Hey, we're speaking with immigration attorney Kate Lincoln-Goldfinch. She is the owner and CEO of Lincoln-Goldfinch Law in Austin, Texas, who, of course, has a lot of experience dealing with many immigration cases in their area. And I have another question that has to do with, well, national security, because immigration officials claim that, well, this decision that the Supreme Court recently made that allows deportations to third countries essentially strengthens national security, but at the same time limits the ability of immigrants to challenge their deportation. So I guess, can you explain how immigration law typically weighs national security against the rights of individuals to get a fair hearing?
Well, I think that the Trump administration likes to throw out national security for sure. So they're going to base everything on, oh, well, this is a national security decision, or this is a foreign policy decision, and that's why the executive should be left alone, should be allowed to overreach, should be allowed to make decisions autonomously. So I think that that's something that we hear about a lot, and I think actually the opposite would be true in these situations. And we are deporting people to, let's say we have a Chinese national and we deport that person to South Sudan. I would think that would only harm our relationship with the government of China, for example. And so I don't think that these third-party deportations do anything but hurt national security and foreign policy, actually. So I think we just all have to take that with a grain of salt. Whenever I hear the Trump administration talk about, oh, the reason is national security, I dig a little bit deeper.
Yeah, it's very important to dig a little bit deeper, especially when you look at the, well, criminal records or lack thereof of people that are being deported to some of these places like El Salvador and others, and it turns out, well, they largely didn't have any criminal record whatsoever, or if they did, it was something very minor like a parking ticket or something like that. I want to talk a little bit about the dissent from Justice Sotomayor at the Supreme Court, because she warned that this ruling could expose people to torture or death. So I don't know how much experience you have with dealing with immigrants who have been deported to these types of countries, but how realistic is that concern of people possibly facing torture or death or repercussions from these governments that they're being deported to?
I think that torture is probable in these situations, and death is certainly possible. A lot of these people are going to be going to Guantanamo and then on their way to other third-party countries, and we know the history with Guantanamo. Many of them have gone to CCOT, the prison in El Salvador for gang members, where people don't. It's a life sentence. Nobody gets out. Everybody knows that torture occurs at this facility, and then some of these facilities in Libya and Sudan. All of this is new. It's not as if this has been going on for years, and so we have a history of it. But the early reports of what is likely to occur with people who are deported to these locations is incredibly disturbing, including, like I mentioned, people being sold into slavery in these other countries if they are deported there.
So what legal options, if any, exist do migrants still have after this ruling if they fear harm in the country where they are being sent to? Do they still have any recourse, or what could they potentially do if they are facing the ramifications of going to one of these, well, countries that might not be so friendly to them? Is there any legal recourse that they still have, or has this largely been kind of shot down now by the Supreme Court where they really don't have a lot of recourse that they can go through right now?
So right now there's very little to do because this was a temporary ruling. This was about an injunction, which is a temporary ruling that occurs before the final decision on a legal matter. So we are awaiting the final decision of these actions. But in the meantime, the Supreme Court has allowed these deportations to occur. So it's really tricky. I mean, I represent a couple of Venezuelan men who are detained and who would accept a voluntary removal, but only to Venezuela. And it's really risky to sign an agreement and accept a voluntary departure, because then they could just be sent to some third country without any notice or any ability to fight it. So, I mean, honestly, from an immigrant perspective, an advocate perspective, how we protect people right now that's really been eroded, and it's really concerning. And a lot of us are worried. But I will also say the vast majority of people who are detained and deported are going to be sent to their own country. I think that this is a very concerning decision and worthy of conversation, but I also hope that the immigrant community around the United States understands that the vast majority, overwhelming majority of people who get deported are going to be received by their own country, and so they won't find themselves in the situation of being sent to a third country.
I want to back up to something you said just a few minutes ago, talking about how people do have the option to self-deport. And you brought up the idea that if someone does self-deport, they're not necessarily set to go to their original homeland. They very well could end up in a different country. So if someone does decide to self-deport, is there any obligation by the government to send them back to their original country? Or is it pretty much once you sign one of those agreements saying, hey, I'm going to deport myself, as you kind of were alluding to, you're likely to end up back in your homeland, but there still is that possibility that you could end up going somewhere else?
You could end up going somewhere else, even if you've stipulated to only be returned to your own country, and that's one of the things that we're battling with is I guess we don't stipulate anymore, but the problem is that people are in detention, and the detention conditions right now are so terrible because our detention facilities are overrun. So what's happening with all these people who are getting placed in detention is they're getting desperate and they just want to give up and get out. It's actually very sad. The medical care, water, food, all of that is really terrible. But in these situations, my advice as a lawyer is going to be that nobody agrees to a deportation in moments like these, because there's no guarantee that you're not going to be sent somewhere else. It's just like detaining people at the courthouse and at their check-ins. It's the actions of the Trump administration encourage behavior or outcomes that they don't actually want, which is people not stipulating to agreements or people not going to their court appointments or their check-ins.
I hate to interrupt you, but we are coming up on a hard break, but we are going to continue our conversation. We're speaking with Kate Lincoln-Goldfinch, an immigration attorney, up next here on The Matt McNeil Show. Right now we're speaking with immigration attorney Kate Lincoln-Goldfinch. She's the owner and CEO of Lincoln-Goldfinch Law in Austin, Texas, or at lincolngoldfinch.com. Apologize, Kate, as we were coming up on a hard break just a few moments ago, but you were talking about some of the recourses or maybe lack thereof that migrants might have after this ruling if they, fear harm with the country that they're being sent to. So I'd like to continue where you were going with that in terms of some of the options immigrants might have.
When we can't trust the Trump administration to behave legally or to reward good behavior, people start to be less cooperative. So an example of that is if we don't know that someone's going to be removed to their home country, they're not going to sign a voluntary departure agreement. Or if they know that if they go to their ICE appointment or their court check-in, they're just going to be detained, they're more inclined to just skip the appointment. And so when the Trump administration is trying to get people to cooperate and do things the legal way, as they say, but they take actions like this, it just really sends the wrong message, and it sends the whole system into disarray. I mean, immigrants just, honestly, they feel hated right now. They feel so unwanted by this country, and it's really, really sad to hear that people, they don't feel the appreciation or the respect, and it's so, we know this. It's so hard to be an immigrant, to give up everything, to come to a new country, a new culture, just because you want a better life. They work so hard. They contribute so much to this country, and then they're just treated like, trash, and even the people who are following the rules. I mean, it's just really disheartening talking to the immigrants and understanding how they're feeling right now because of all of these policies.
Now, as we were talking about a few moments ago in the previous segment, how this is a temporary Supreme Court ruling, and it was largely ruled on by what's called a shadow docket, which means it didn't have a full hearing or a detailed explanation. I guess in your experience, is this common for major immigration decisions to come from that so-called shadow docket? And what are the concerns with this approach?
No, that's why I say it was sort of surprising. I mean, they could have just not ruled. They could have just left it as it was and allowed for the full case to come up through the court. So it's just confusing about why they did this or what their thinking was. Of course, we don't have a full decision, so we don't understand the thinking. I think it's a really concerning move by the court, this allowance of the Trump administration to not follow court orders and then to just go ahead and grant them carte blanche. It's sort of, I mean, it's like, you know, in the way that we've seen Congress sort of throw away its own power. That's a bit of what the court was doing in this move, is just sort of turning over this carte blanche power to the Trump administration, even though they've been bad actors in this precise issue.
And final question for you. Obviously, you are a practicing immigration attorney. What's been the biggest change that you've experienced since January 2025, or the biggest new challenges that you've had to experience, well, since we had the changeover in the administration at the federal level?
Absolutely, especially being in Texas, it's been the interior enforcement operations and the things that everybody is seeing on the news. ICE agents, other law enforcement agents are just taking people off the streets, and they're in plain clothes, and they're wearing masks, and they're not identifying themselves. And all of this stuff is actually happening. You know, I've seen this happen with my own clients. This last week, I had 14 clients picked up, the vast majority of whom were attending legal appointments. And so just this attack on people who are doing everything they know how to do the right way, you know, like I keep saying, it's just sending this message to immigrants that they aren't safe. They aren't safe to even pursue legal immigration avenues. And it's heartbreaking what's happening.
It very much is when you see what's happening in Texas and California and around the country. Yeah, when you do see people in unmarked clothing or in masks, largely snatching people up off the streets, it's, very, very concerning. We have been speaking with immigration attorney Kate Lincoln-Goldfinch. She is the owner and CEO of Lincoln-Goldfinch Law in Austin, Texas. You can learn more about her and her firm over at LincolnGoldfinch.com. That is LincolnGoldfinch.com. Kate, really appreciate you coming on the show today. Thanks so much for coming on and going a little bit long with us as well.
Thank you. My husband's Minnesotan. He said I have to say Skol Vikings.
Oh, Skol. Hey, I'll take that. Yeah. As long as you're not like a Cowboys fan or something.
No, I'm a Vikings fan.
Hey, we'll take that for sure. Absolutely. Well, hey, Kate, thanks so much for coming on the show. We'll definitely have you back sometime.
Okay, sounds good. Talk to you soon.